Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show.
Hello and welcome again to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast, but not for much longer, about Mark's Gospel, the greatest story ever told. We believe there's only 2 more episodes after this one. I lost count last time, but then we're finished. Anyway, we're very pleased that you chose to spend a few minutes today with us and hope you'll feel it was worthwhile. My name's David Payne and I will be your host for this episode in our journey through Mark's Gospel. Today, we are delighted to have Nick King with us. Father Nicholas King, who is in central London, I believe. Nick, tell me if I've got this right, but you're a Jesuit priest who has spent his life teaching in schools and universities, mainly, though not exclusively, on New Testament and New Testament languages. And then I guess your main claim to fame is publishing a translation of the Greek Bible, published by Kevin Mayhew, which is quite a job, I imagine.
It certainly was, yes.
And you're currently working in the Jesuit parish of Farm Street in central London.
That's right.
Anything else we should know about you?
Well, except I did work for 13 years in South Africa at the most interesting time of that country's history, when it was shifting uneasily from apartheid to the present democratic arrangement.
Wow.
And that made a difference to the way I read the scriptures, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would it be fair to also add, Nick, that you've written on Mark's Gospel specifically, haven't you? And maybe
I have, yes.
What's the
I think
title?
one of the books was called The Strangest Gospel, and that tells you what I think about Mark.
Oh, right. And tell me, I like to ask our guests this question. What is it about the gospel generally, I guess, broadening it out a bit, that grabs your attention, and that I guess you've given a lot of your life to serving God and reading the Bible?
I suppose yes, certainly. I mean, well, that's what I do most of the day, reading the Bible. Yeah. An extraordinary experience. I mean, Mark almost certainly invented the gospel form that we call gospel, and it was kind of dictated to him by the life of Jesus. He came first; all the others almost certainly followed him. I don't believe it any other way around is possible. Mm. And he's got a bleakness to him at times, liveliness, very impressive piece of writing. And I just love Mark.
Thank you very much indeed. We love Mark as well, don't we, Steph?
We do. We're glad you're here, Nick.
We're sorry it's coming to an end. Steph, so how do you know each other?
I saw Nick on a bit of publicity about a day on spiritual direction and Mark's Gospel. Because I dabble in both of those things, as you know. I thought, oh, that sounds a fascinating combination. So that's how we got in touch in the first place. And then through one way or another, Nick is here with us, which I'm excited about.
Yeah. Right. So we've got a job to do here, Steph, haven't we? Because after the next 2 episodes, we're done. And all these episodes are going to be available forever on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, wherever, available to anybody who wants to download them. Is that right?
That is correct.
From the first day of Advent, I'm told, it's going to be the year of Mark next year. That's so right. If any of our listeners know anybody who might be preaching on Mark or might be interested in the year of Mark, the relevant episode would probably be quite an interesting place to start thinking about it.
I'd like to think so. I think we've had some wonderful conversations, haven't we, David, over the last year or 2, with some amazing people of all sorts of backgrounds and shades of opinion. So I'm hopeful this could be a resource for people. As we're talking about the year of Mark, perhaps I ought to mention a couple more things. I might be quite busy myself as a performer of Mark's Gospel, I suspect, in the next few months. So that would be of interest perhaps to some. And also, I promised a good friend of ours, a man called Darrell Wentworth, who's a deacon in America, to mention the fact that he has, with me, produced a film version of Mark's Gospel called I Am Mark, by CMAX TV, and that's going to be particularly promoted over the next year. And finally, there's another person who's been on this podcast who I ought to mention at this point, Brandon Robbins, who's been on the podcast, I think, a couple of times. His organization has an online Bible study which anyone can join called Beyond the Words, and they are looking at Mark's Gospel in specifically next year as well.
Right in the spotlight then. So let's hope people do tell people if you know someone who is interested in Mark, or if you're interested in Mark yourself. Fantastic. Well, that's the introductions over. Now somebody, possibly not Lucy Warner, but somebody's about to read Mark's Gospel to us on the burial of Jesus before we get going on the discussion proper. So over to you.
Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learnt from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid.
That's great. So that's the passage we're looking at, the burial of Jesus, and I'm sure there's plenty to talk about in there. I was going to go through some questions, starting with Joseph of Arimathea. On the Facebook group, I made a comment that I thought Joseph of Arimathea was doing a great thing and would be remembered forever, and was compassionate and kind and bold. And John, who made a comment on it, our friend John Burnett, saying, actually, perhaps, and there are different versions of this, aren't there? Different views. Joseph was a reputable Jewish council member who wanted to make sure there were no dead bodies out in the Sabbath and Passover, and at some potential risk to himself, took care of the burial. So the point I'm making, I think, is you can read more into a passage than is actually there. But I wonder what you two think about that, because there are different opinions, aren't there, Steph?
Indeed. Shall I start, or do you want to start, Nick? I'm happy for you to start if you'd like.
All right. Mark does interesting things with names. He mentions a name and he assumes that we're going to know who it is. So he mentions John the Baptist right at the beginning. He mentions Simon and Andrew right at the beginning. At the end of chapter 10, he talks about Bartimaeus. In chapter 14, which you've already looked at, or 15, he talks about Simon the Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus. So Mark's community knew who this was. So they knew who Joseph of Arimathea was, and therefore we assume that Mark approves of them, including Joseph. Why might he approve? Well, he has the nerve to go to Pilate. The Greek means he dared to go to Pilate, which is strong stuff.
Yeah.
He's also described as a well-shaped counselor, whatever that may mean. And it also, Mark says of him, he was expecting the kingdom of God. And right from the beginning of the gospel, that's a sign of a good person. So I'm all in favor of Joseph of Arimathea.
I might have a slightly different view, but I bow to your knowledge of the Greek there, Nick. I must say, I think it's a little bit more ambiguous than that. And for a variety of reasons, I guess I'm siding with the John Burnett view of these things. The fact is that it, for instance, says he's a prominent member of the council in my translation. You said he was well-shaped.
Yes.
I think that phrase is quite interesting. From my understanding of the Greek, please correct me, that if I'm wrong, but the well-shaped could perhaps indicate that he was substantial, as in wealthy. And the fact that he's a member of the council raised my alarm bells as well, because I've just read in chapter 14, the whole council condemned Jesus to death. So either Joseph was secretly not persuaded to the point of view which Mark clearly indicates all of them condemned him to death, or he wasn't there. So there's something a bit worrying about Joseph.
Yeah, but there are worrying things about all Mark's treatments of people, including the disciples. They virtually always get it wrong. The only people who don't get it wrong are the women. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. The key thing is that Joseph is waiting for the kingdom of God.
I was going to come to that as well, because
right, okay.
Because I agree. It's interesting. When you first read that, from my point of view, you see it's a positive aspect of Joseph's background here. But and especially when it says, what in my NIV translation, it says he was himself awaiting the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
To stress perhaps that this is something that he shares with others in the story, and perhaps people who Mark approves of, as you say. But the phrase waiting got my attention, because Jesus says at the beginning of the gospel, does he not, that the kingdom of God is here. I know in my translation it says the word is near, it's used near then, but actually what Jesus really is implying is that the kingdom of God has arrived. This is the moment, it's begun. And so when Mark uses that phrase, waiting for the kingdom of God, well, that could mean no more than him exactly that, waiting for the kingdom of God, but not necessarily aligning himself with Jesus.
Can I be slightly interfering there? Because it's the Greek word can mean awaiting, but it's stronger, I think, in Mark. It means expecting.
Right.
So really quite attentive and wagging his tail.
Right. I get you. I like that. I like that. Anyway, as to Joseph himself, I wonder whether there is something interesting going on with this ambiguity, which at least I believe is there. Yes, I would say on the one hand, he seems to be a supporter of Jesus, and certainly the other Gospels indicate that he is. And yet in Mark, it's not so clear. And I'm wondering, let me just play the devil's advocate, if you like, for a little while. Let's pretend that Joseph was actually not sympathetic to Christ. And there was another reason why he went to Pilate to ask for the body. And I think the reason perhaps is given in verse 42, because it says it was preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath. So Joseph had to approach. The reason perhaps that Joseph approached was because leaving Jesus up on the cross meant that, a bit longer, beyond sunset, meant that someone would have to break the Sabbath to bury him if he was already dead. And similarly, I think it says in Deuteronomy chapter 21 that the Jewish law forbids a man hanging on a tree not being taken down after the day of his death. And if the Jewish community don't take that man down, basically the whole land will be cursed. So you could read this as no more than a response from a very, albeit devoted man of God, but a member of the Jewish authorities rather than necessarily a secret follower of Jesus. And to dare to go to Pilate may be an indication of his love of Jesus, but it may also be because from Pilate's point of view, this was a criminal. This was a man who'd encouraged sedition against the Roman state, just like the other two men who were crucified with him, the two guerrillas. So for Joseph to go to Pilate for whatever reason and ask for this man to be buried, at this stage, when it was quite customary to leave people hanging on the cross for weeks, actually, was extremely daring, but not necessarily an indication of his support.
It's certainly a possible way of reading it.
That's very gracious of you. Is it possible, though? I mean, I'm just wondering, and again, it's just a hypothesis, no more. This story comes on the back of another event, which suggests that surprising things are happening to Jesus's enemies. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that Joseph isn't a friend, but he's an enemy. But nevertheless, he does go to take down Jesus's body. So there's a sense in which he could be a supporter. We're not sure.
Yes.
And the same is true of the centurion just before. The centurion says, "This is the Son of God," and this is the man who crucified him.
Yes, he's also the only human being to get Jesus right in the whole of Mark's Gospel.
Exactly, and yet he's an enemy. It is fascinating, isn't it? Both these people come at this point in the story.
See, I think this shows Mark's skill. Mark gives a lot of ambiguity in his characters, with the exception, as I say, of the women. Well, except for 1.5 women. But that's another story.
Why do you say he does well to create ambiguity? Because it seems to me the people who first heard this would have understood about Joseph, for example, much better than we do. They'd have known who he was.
Yes.
You'd say.
Well, they knew him, and we didn't, so they would immediately have various clues.
Why is ambiguity a benefit? Because that just annoys me.
It is to us. I mean, yes. Mark's first hearers, not readers, would have known the after story of Joseph of Arimathea. Yeah. But we were just guessing as we talk here. Yeah. But my guess is more favourable to Joseph of Arimathea than your guess is.
So, we'll move on. Let's move on. That's all right. We can have disagreements, can't we? So Pilate and the centurion. So Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead, and then there was all this about checking that was he really dead. Is that to make absolutely sure for everybody? So there's no ambiguity in the future. For us now, we know Jesus was dead. Everyone said he was dead. Is that what this is about?
That is certainly part of it, yeah. Yeah.
I agree. I think the fact is it's mentioned already dead. It's mentioned twice. And I wonder whether Mark is making it clear to us and to the readers of the time, or the listeners, that Jesus was absolutely dead. There's no question about it.
And later on, there was a very big issue. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. As the gospel is preached, so the Jewish authorities would say, "Oh, actually, no, Jesus was never dead." Or and there were other heresies, were they not, later on in the history of the church, which suggested that. So here,
Nick, you said that was part of it. What else was there involved in this?
Involved in what?
With Pilate and the centurion and this whole section in verse 44.
Well, there's a contrast with I keep talking about the women, but they are important in Mark's Gospel. Immediately before, you will have looked at this in your last session, you've got the women who are looking on from afar. There's Mary Magdalene, Mary of Jacob, and the mother of Joses and Salome. And then immediately after this, there's Mary the Magdalene and Mary of Joses, and they were watching where he was laid. Yeah. So, and it's an imperfect tense. It's not they saw, it was they were looking. So a really attentive moment. And I think that's very important in Mark's Gospel. And it's to counter the notion that they might have forgotten where Jesus was buried, or they couldn't have possibly known. Mark is clear that the women, God bless them, certainly did know.
And they're witnesses, aren't they, to the fact that he was buried.
Very important. Yeah. And of course, the men aren't. The men have run away. Bye.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I totally agree with you that the women are given a much better press than the men. As you said, and also because it mentions in verse 40, I know it's not in our, and 41, I know it's not in our reading, but it is relevant because it
belongs with it, yeah.
It belongs to it, exactly. The women are mentioned at the beginning of this passage, if you like, and they're mentioned at the end.
So it's one of Mark's sandwiches.
Indeed. So that suggests, does it not? Maybe we can go back to the centurion and Joseph, that the people in the middle maybe need to be reflected upon in view of what the women have been described as.
Absolutely.
But the women certainly are said to follow him and to serve him. I think they use, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Greek word for serve is diakono.
Diakonio, yes.
Which is like where we get deacon from, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
And they seem, as you were saying, to be model disciples, whereas
absolutely
they follow and they serve, whereas the men don't. And I think that's wonderful, because for me, that's a very great example of Mark's topsy-turvy understanding of what the kingdom of God is like, what Jesus says the kingdom of God is like. It's not meant to be for important people. It's actually for the last and the least who are the important people. And the women in that community would have been seen as obviously inferior to men, but they're given prominence here as more devoted than the men who simply run away.
And of course, you're going to see when you come to the next bit in chapter 16 that the women are brave enough to go into the tomb, for heaven's sake. It's astonishing.
And interestingly, I hadn't noticed this before, but I read in a commentary there were 3 of them. And they're all named for the reasons perhaps we suggested earlier. But 3, that reminds me of 3 disciples. Well, the main 3, of course, mentioned again and again before this incident are Peter, James, and John. But the women seem to have taken over as Jesus's most steadfast disciple.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is one question mark though for me about the women. They are watching, I agree, and I love that. I didn't know that about the word watching. They, as in look intently. And by the by, I wonder whether that in some way reflects Jesus's own emphasis on watching in chapter 14 and at the end of chapter 13, where he implores his disciples to watch carefully.
Alas, it's a different Greek word. That's
a different Greek word. Oh, well, forget it then. But my point is, though, they are at a distance. As in, yes, they are followers of Jesus. Yes, they are devoted to him. Yes, they will serve him continually. Yes. But they don't do the ultimate, which Jesus expects, if you like, of his disciples, which is, as in chapter 8, to follow me, deny oneself, and take up your cross.
Maybe not. The last time that word from afar was used, it was used of Peter, who followed Jesus from afar.
Yes.
So it's whatever's true of Peter in that sense is true also of the women.
That's a lovely point. Yeah, because Peter is slightly ambiguous with Peter, isn't it?
He is.
When I perform it, I do often emphasize from afar in a way as to suggest, oh, that's fine, but it's only going so far. It's a little cowardly. So I don't know. It's a fascinating point there.
It is.
Okay. So Joseph has the body, and then verse 46. I wonder whether, is there anything significant about the linen cloth? A linen cloth does appear later on, doesn't it?
Hard to be sure. It says that he went and bought a sindon, is the Greek word. The last time we heard that word was in chapter 14, when the unnamed disciple was arrested and ran away naked, which was a terrible disgrace for a Jewish person. And he took off he let his sindon go. That doesn't sound, some argue that doesn't sound like a luxurious piece of clothing, but at any rate, it was covering him. It was doing its job, and he's got rid of it. So my reading of sindon there is that it's something quite expensive.
That's lovely. I like that. I must admit, I can't help remembering the young man from chapter 14. Yeah. Read this. I don't know whether it's intentional on Mark's part to make us do that, but the young man, as you know, so many people have understood that in so many different ways.
Yes.
I know for some, though, they link it with the beginning of chapter 16, where there's another young man, not dressed in a sindon, in another Greek word, but nevertheless dressed in a robe, with white clothing. So it's almost like there's a kind of playing going on, perhaps, between.
And I think Mark teases us. Mark asks us to sort this out. Can you work out what I'm saying here?
Yeah, and I wonder, it could be, this is again hypothesizing, but the young man in chapter 14, I tend to look at nowadays as a positive rather than a negative, insofar as some people would say, oh, it's another example of Jesus's disciples leaving him at the last moment, departing from him because he flees away naked, and that's shameful. But I think there's something about the fact that the young man does follow Jesus at that point rather than fleeing immediately. So there is a more positive angle being spun.
Yeah.
It seems to me to suggest perhaps there's hope. I don't know, but I can't really now, as I think about it, piece it all together. But there's a sense in which the resurrection is entwined somehow in the story of Jesus's death.
I think that's a good way of putting it, and that's really important. We cannot just preach the death of Jesus. We have to preach the death and resurrection. And also we must preach that we disciples do get it wrong. And I think the young man in 1451 does get it wrong. I think Peter gets it wrong. But that's not the end of the story.
Yeah.
Because Jesus still keeps them going.
Yeah, brilliant.
So Mark often has other things going on that another message he wants to get across, apart from just simply recording this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened.
Yeah.
Is there anything we've missed, or anything that we should have noticed in this passage that?
Well, one important thing right at the beginning of the passage is the phrase "and when it grew late." Very important, because that's introducing the Sabbath. And every time you've seen the word Sabbath in Mark's Gospel so far, up to this point, it's been a neuralgic point for a clash with scribes and Pharisees. So you're wondering what's going to happen this time. And I think that's important.
Yes, I like that. Yeah. I think I just want to stress this idea that even in this most desperate situation, it's very bleak, isn't it? It's very bleak, but nevertheless, there are signs of hope. The conduct of the women, the conduct of Joseph, however you take him, the centurion, the fact that Jesus is pronounced dead, and it's very, very clear he's dead. And we remember what Jesus has been saying all the way through the later part of the gospel, that he's going to die.
Yes.
It says he's going to rise again. So there is.
And also, we know the names of Simon, Peter, and Joseph of Arimathea. That means they weren't lost, the Christian community.
Yes.
And I think that's really important. So you quite rightly use the word ambiguity, because on the one hand, they get it wrong, as you and I frequently get it wrong. But on the other hand, they were there at the end. Yeah. And they were part of the community as it was founded afterwards.
Yeah. Is there any, I was struggling earlier, Nick and David, to try and get some devotional or relevant spiritual meaning from this for our own purposes. I found myself thinking about the bleakness of this scene, recognizing the hope in it as well, and thinking about the moments that we, as all human beings do, suffer. Yet with God, there is that sense of hope, and beyond our suffering, even resurrection. Would that be going too far in thinking about this passage?
No, I think it's quite. Mark, as people are always saying, 3 times has Jesus predict his passion, but each time, and we don't notice this, each time it's passion and resurrection. So Mark, despite what they sometimes say, really is a believer in the resurrection. And as far as I'm concerned, and Paul is certainly of this view, there's no such thing as Christianity without the resurrection.
Very good. Is there anything else that either of you hasn't had a chance to say in this passage? Or anything else we should have noticed? It's quite a short passage, isn't it? Go on.
I do want to mention something which I hadn't noticed before until our friend John Burnett mentioned it to me. It's the fact that Joseph here doesn't anoint the body, doesn't wash it. Now, what we make of that in terms of Joseph's allegiances or character, we've already discussed, but it's interesting that he doesn't. And the women who are mentioned here are the ones who, in the next chapter, do.
But that is a woman's job, of course, in that culture.
Ah, okay, that makes sense.
But that's my explanation. Yeah.
Yeah. Good thought.
It's a marvelous passage, very bleak, and the second half of Mark's Gospel is terribly bleak, but it's not the end of the story, and that's really important.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we might be done, unless anybody's got any other questions or any other thoughts. Well, Nick King, thank you for teaching us some Greek. Thank you for being on the show. It's been a real pleasure, and Steph, as always. So that's the end of our podcast for today. So from Nick King, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
And from Stephen Smart.
Goodbye.
And from me, until next time, only 2 more to go. Get your questions into question mark. Goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stephen Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We'll light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show.